Freddie Mercury joined Tokyo street musician. What happened next changed his final years and left 100 witnesses speechless in 1985, when Queen had long since become one of the most famous rock bands in the world. Freddie Mercury, despite his overwhelming success, continued to search for new sources of inspiration. After the exhausting The Works tour, which concluded at the beginning of the year, he felt the need for a creative reset. Years of endless concerts, studio sessions, and press tours had taken their toll. Freddie, accustomed to grand stages and relentless public attention, began to yearn for moments when music was born spontaneously, without pomp and expectations. It was then that he decided to embark on a journey that was meant to be not just a break, but an opportunity to reconnect with the very essence of music, live, unpredictable, and sincere. Tokyo was his destination. Japan had always fascinated Freddie with its unique culture, blending ancient traditions with rapid technological progress. He had first visited the city in 1979 during Queen's tour and had never been able to forget it since. The ritual of the tea ceremony, the silence of temple gardens, contrasting with the deafening noise of the streets, and of course, Japanese music, whose melodies seemed to speak a language understandable without words. For Freddie, whose musical aesthetic always leaned toward experimentation and the synthesis of different styles, Japan was not just an exotic destination, it was a source of new ideas. He often said that music had no borders, and in Tokyo, he hoped to find proof of this belief. However, the 1985 trip was different from previous ones. Whereas in 1979 and 1981, Queen had arrived with massive concerts filling stadiums, this time Freddie decided to travel incognito. He did not publicize his visit, limiting it to a few close friends and trusted employees. This was unusual for a man whose name was synonymous with sensational headlines and spectacular shows. But Freddie was tired of constant attention. He wanted to simply walk the city streets, listen to street musicians, inhale the aromas of night food stalls, and perhaps once again feel like the young singer who had started out performing in small London clubs. He knew he might be recognized in Tokyo. Queen enjoyed immense popularity in Japan, but he hoped that without security and managers, he could remain unnoticed, at least for a while. Moreover, this visit was tied to personal reasons. In 1985, Freddie was going through a period of interchange. Despite his external success, he felt that the music industry was becoming increasingly formulaic, and his own creativity was under pressure from commercial expectations. He wanted to return to his roots, to what had inspired him in his youth, the freedom of improvisation, to music born in the moment, without premeditated arrangements and producer instructions. He dreamed of meeting a musician who, like himself, lived through music, not a brand. Perhaps this is why he chose Tokyo, a city where ancient traditions and modernity intertwined so naturally that even street music here sounded like a dialogue between past and future. Upon arriving in Japan, Freddie stayed at a small hotel in the Asakusa district, away from the luxurious Ginza hotels where celebrities usually stayed. He chose this area deliberately. Asakusa, with its temples, traditional shops, and narrow alleys, seemed ideal for remaining unnoticed. Here, he could walk without disguise, without fear of being recognized by passers-by. In his free time, he wandered around Senso-ji, tried street food, and observed city life. But as the days passed, he increasingly felt drawn to Ginza, a district that, despite its reputation as a center of luxury and fashion, retained a nocturnal atmosphere brimming with creative energy. One evening, while strolling through Ginza, Freddie heard music that made him stop. It was an unusual sound, a mix of ancient Japanese motifs and modern rhythms played on an instrument he couldn't immediately identify. The musician, dressed in a simple kimono, stood by the entrance of a small shop, playing the shamisen, a traditional three-stringed instrument whose sharp, almost piercing timbre perfectly fit the city's nocturnal symphony. But the way he played was unusual. His performance blended classical techniques with improvisation reminiscent of jazz passages. Freddie, whose soul always gravitated toward musical experimentation, couldn't walk past. He approached, and, at that moment, their eyes met. The musician didn't seem surprised by his presence. Perhaps he didn't know who stood before him, or maybe he was simply accustomed to his music attracting attention. But in his eyes, Freddie saw what he had been searching for: the spark of creative fire, that very immediacy that makes music alive. At that moment, amid Ginza's neon lights, under the sounds of the shamisen and the city's whispers, the story began. One that many consider a myth, but, according to witnesses, truly happened. The story in which Freddie Mercury, the great showman, for a moment became simply a musician playing on the street with a stranger whose name remains unknown to this day. This encounter, as the legend goes, gave birth to a song that never appeared on any Queen album, but perhaps still lies hidden somewhere in Tokyo's archives, waiting to be found. Tokyo in 1985 was a city where past and future danced in a curious waltz. Streets paved with stone since the Edo era were now surrounded by skyscrapers, their glass facades reflecting neon signs brighter than stars. Ginza, the heart of Tokyo's luxury, by day was an elegant avenue of boutiques and galleries, but at night it transformed into something entirely different, an intimate yet vibrant space where music, the aromas of street food, and the whispers of passers-by created an atmosphere both personal and lively. For Freddie, accustomed to London pubs and New York jazz clubs, this district felt both foreign and familiar. Here, as in his favorite places around the world, music was part of everyday life, but it spoke a language he didn't yet fully understand. Nighttime Ginza in 1985 was full of contrasts. On one side, luxury reigned, Mitsukoshi and Waco store windows gleamed under soft lighting, and from the open doors of restaurants came laughter and the clinking of glasses. On the other, in the alleys between major streets, life thrived in ways tourists rarely considered. Street vendors sold okonomiyaki and takoyaki. Their small stalls emitted aromas of soy sauce and green onions, while nearby, young people in jeans and leather jackets discussed the music they had just heard at a recently opened jazz bar. Tokyo at the time was experiencing a musical revolution. Alongside traditional genres, jazz, rock, and even early experiments with electronic music were actively developing. Street musicians, usually overshadowed by major stars, set the city's rhythm, turning every stroll into an unexpected musical discovery. Freddie always felt at home in such places. For him, music was not a show but a dialogue, and he valued moments when it was born spontaneously, without preparation or expectations. In London, he often dropped into pubs to listen to local bands, and in New York, he spent hours in jazz clubs, observing how musicians improvised, tossing phrases back and forth like old friends. But in Tokyo, everything was different. Here, music wasn't just sound. It was part of culture, a ritual rooted in centuries. Traditional instruments like the koto and shamisen weren't used only in classical compositions but also in modern experiments where their sounds blended with rock guitars and synthesizers. For Freddie, whose music always sought synthesis, this was inspiring. He walked through Ginza without a goal, savoring the chance to be just a person among people. Dressed in his simple black shirt and jeans, he felt almost invisible. In 1985 Tokyo, long hair and a beard didn't stand out as they did in Europe or America. Moreover, despite Queen's popularity in Japan, their fans rarely expected to see Freddie alone, without security and managers. He savored this anonymity, allowing himself to slow down, stop at a street food stall, or listen to passers-by's conversations. The city seemed to open up to him in a new way. There was no pressure of fame, only music that sounded everywhere, from open windows, from shops, from underfoot, as he walked on the pavement. But the most astonishing thing about nighttime Tokyo was how music coexisted with silence here. In London or New York, nighttime noise was constant, but in Tokyo, even in the busiest district, one could hear moments when the city fell silent, as if remembering its temples and gardens. The silence, however, wasn't empty. It was filled with anticipation, like a pause between notes in a musical phrase. Freddie, whose music always valued dynamics and contrast, felt this acutely. He knew that true improvisation was born in such moments, when silence and sound flowed into each other, creating something new. It was during one such moment that he heard a sound that made him stop. At first, it was a barely perceptible rustle, like wind through bamboo, but as he approached the source, Freddie realized it was music. It came from a narrow alley leading off the main Ginza Street, where there were usually fewer tourists and more locals. There, in a semicircle of light from an old street lamp, stood a man in a simple kimono, holding a shamisen on his lap. His fingers moved across the strings with such confidence, as if he had done this his entire life, but the melody he played wasn't entirely traditional. It carried ancient Japanese motifs, but the rhythm was modern, almost jazzy, with pauses and accents that Freddie immediately appreciated. The shamisen, an instrument usually associated with classical theaters and rituals, here sounded new. Its sharp, almost piercing timbre, created by a leather membrane stretched over a wooden body, perfectly fit the city's nocturnal symphony. But the way the musician played was unusual. He didn't follow strict conventions but experimented, adding elements that seemed to have nothing to do with Japanese tradition. Freddie, whose music always sought stylistic fusion, felt his heart race. This was the music he had been searching for, alive, unpredictable, born in the moment. He approached, careful not to disrupt the atmosphere. The musician seemed not to notice him. His gaze was fixed on the instrument, his body moving to the music's rhythm. But when Freddie stopped a few steps away, the musician looked up and met his eyes. There was no surprise in his gaze, only calm acceptance, as if he had been expecting this moment. Perhaps he didn't know who stood before him, but Freddie felt it no longer mattered. Here in this alley, they were simply two musicians divided by language but united by shared passion. Freddie smiled and, without a word, raised his hand in approval. The musician nodded in response and continued playing. But this time the melody changed. It became more rhythmic, inviting. And then Freddie understood it wasn't just a concert. It was a challenge, an invitation to join. He took a step forward, and at that moment, the story began that many consider a legend, but, according to witnesses, truly happened. The musician standing under the dim street lamp was a man whose presence immediately captured Freddie's attention. His kimono, simple and slightly worn, contrasted with the impeccable elegance of passers-by in expensive suits and evening gowns. But this very simplicity seemed to emphasize his dignity. In his posture, in the way he held the shamisen, there was confidence, almost pride, but without a trace of ostentatious bravado. He wasn't a street performer seeking coins from passers-by, but a man for whom music was not a way to earn money but part of his very being. As Freddie drew closer, he noticed details that deepened his first impression. On the musician's wrist was a thin tattoo in the style of Irezumi, traditional Japanese tattoo art, whose patterns often carried deep symbolic meaning. The tattoo, resembling waves intertwined with cherry blossoms, hinted at a connection to the sea and the fleeting beauty of life, themes common in Japanese philosophy. But the most striking thing was in his eyes. They were calm, as if belonging to someone who had seen much and learned to accept the world as it is. There was no trace of fear or doubt, only the focused characteristic of those who fully devote themselves to their craft. Freddie, whose intuition in dealing with people was always sharp, immediately understood that before him was not just a street musician. His bearing, his movements, even the way he nodded in response to Freddie's approving gesture spoke of something greater. Later, recalling this meeting, Freddie often wondered, perhaps this man truly had a connection to the samurai heritage. In Japan, samurai traditions, though having lost their military significance, continued to live in culture, especially in art. Many musicians, artists, and martial arts masters considered themselves spiritual heirs of the samurai, preserving their principles of honor, discipline, and devotion to their path. When the musician finished his improvisation, he lowered the shamisen and looked at Freddie. His gaze was direct, but not challenging, more as if he were trying to understand what had brought this foreigner to this alley in the middle of the night. Freddie, who didn't speak Japanese, smiled and raised his hands in a gesture he hoped conveyed his admiration. The musician nodded, and a smile flickered in his eyes. Then, without a word, he took up the shamisen again and began a new melody, this time more rhythmic, almost inviting. Freddie, whose soul always responded to musical challenges, couldn't pass by. He took another step forward and, raising his hand, signaled that he wanted to join. The musician paused for a moment, as if assessing his intentions, then nodded. Freddie, without hesitation, began to hum. His voice, powerful and expressive even without a microphone, wove into the shameson's melody, creating an unexpected harmony. At first, he sang without words, experimenting with pitch and timbre. But soon his improvisation included phrases blending English with Japanese sounds he had picked up from conversations with locals. The musician seemed surprised, but not unsettled. On the contrary, his playing became freer, almost playful, as if he had found in Freddie a partner with whom he could allow any experiment. Their duet, born spontaneously without preparation, sounded like a dialogue between two worlds, East and West, ancient traditions, and modern improvisation. The shamisen, usually associated with meditative melodies, now sounded almost rock and roll, while Freddie's voice, accustomed to grand arenas, became part of the street symphony where every passerby could be a listener. By this time, a small circle of onlookers had gathered around them. Several passers-by, drawn by the unusual sound, stopped to listen. Some filmed the scene. Portable video cameras were already in use in 1985, though not as widespread as today. A young man dressed in jeans and a t-shirt with a local rock band's logo took out a cassette recorder and began recording. Freddie noticed this, but didn't pay attention. At that moment, he was completely immersed in the music, forgetting even who he was and where he was. Their duet lasted several minutes, but for Freddie, time stretched like in a dream. He felt how the music here, in this alley, differed from what he was used to. There was no pressure of studio time or audience expectations. Here, music was pure, immediate, almost primal in its simplicity, and it was precisely this, as he later admitted, that returned to him the feeling of why he had become a musician in the first place. When the melody ended, the musician lowered the shamisen and looked at Freddie. In his eyes was respect but not awe, rather the recognition of an equal. He nodded, and this gesture said more than words. Freddie responded the same way, feeling that something important had happened but not trying to make sense of it. At such moments, analysis was unnecessary. It was enough just to be here and now. One of the onlookers, an elderly Japanese man in a formal suit, approached the musician and placed several bills into the open shamisen case. The musician bowed, and this gesture, full of dignity, further reinforced Freddie's belief that before him was not just a street performer. Perhaps this man was a master who had preserved a connection to ancient traditions, but wasn't afraid to experiment with modernity. Freddie wanted to say something but understood that without a common language, words would be powerless. Instead, he again raised his hand in thanks and, smiling, stepped back. The musician nodded in response, and our meeting, lasting only a few minutes, ended as unexpectedly as it began. But for Freddie, it became a turning point. For the first time in a long while, he felt that music could be free, that it didn't have to serve commercial purposes or meet expectations. It could simply be, here and now, on the street, under a street lamp, between two people speaking different languages but understanding each other without words. Later, recalling this meeting, Freddie often wondered who this musician was. Perhaps he truly was a descendant of samurai who had preserved a connection to martial arts and art. In Japan, such people existed, masters who combined their ancestors' traditions with modern interests. But even if this wasn't the case, his spirit, his attitude toward music, reminded Freddie of the values samurai considered sacred: devotion to one's path, respect for art, and the ability to find harmony in every moment. For Freddie, this meeting was a reminder that music isn't a show, a brand, or albums sold in million-copy runs. It's a dialogue that can begin at any moment, with anyone, anywhere in the world. And it was this thought, as he later admitted, that inspired many of his boldest experiments in the final years of his life. The musical duet, which began spontaneously under the dim street lamp, quickly transformed into something greater than a simple exchange of melodies. Freddie, whose intuition always told him how to fit into someone else's improvisation, felt that this moment was a rare opportunity to create something unique. He didn't know the musician's name, didn't understand his words, but music became their common language, and it was in this language that they began a dialogue that, as witnesses later claimed, left an impression on those who heard it. At first, Freddie simply hummed, following the rhythm of the shamisen. His voice, usually accustomed to grand arrangements and complex vocal parts, now sounded almost tender, as if he feared disrupting the fragile harmony created by the traditional Japanese instrument. But gradually, sensing that the musician was open to experimentation, he began adding elements familiar to him. Sharp transitions between notes, unexpected pauses mimicking breathing, and even short phrases reminiscent of jazz solos. In turn, the musician adapted to his improvisation, weaving traditional Japanese motifs with rhythms that seemed to come from another world. Particularly impressive was the moment when Freddie began singing a mix of English and Japanese sounds. He didn't know the language well enough to form meaningful phrases, but during his time in Tokyo, he had picked up a few words and expressions, which he now used as musical elements. Sakura, flowers, night. These words, spoken with his accent, sounded almost like mantras, adding a new layer to the texture of their duet. The musician seemed to appreciate this gesture. His playing became even more expressive, and the melody now included chords that, as listeners later noted, simultaneously evoked ancient Japanese chants and bluesy riffs. But the real breakthrough came when Freddie decided to go further. Suddenly, without warning, he began singing a melody that witnesses later called Ginza Twilight. It was a short but remarkably memorable phrase that seemed to arise from nowhere. Its structure was simple: 4 measures, repeated with minor variations, but it carried depth, as if an entire story lay behind this melody. Freddie sang without words, using only vowel sounds, but their pitch and timbre conveyed emotions that needed no translation. The musician, hearing this melody, instantly picked it up, adjusting the shamisen's rhythm to emphasize each note. Their duet became a dialogue where each participant listened to the other, responded, adapted, yet preserved their individuality. The shamisen, usually associated with slow, almost meditative melodies, now sounded sharp and energetic, its strings answering Freddie's vocal passages, creating the effect of a musical dance. Freddie's voice, in turn, adapted to the instrument's peculiarities. He played with pauses, highlighting moments when the shamisen fell silent, and intensified the rhythm when the instrument returned to play. One moment particularly memorable to witnesses involved rhythm. In traditional Japanese music, rhythm is often built on uneven measures where accents shift relative to familiar Western meter. Freddie, whose music usually followed clear rhythmic patterns, initially tried to play at his usual tempo, but soon realized this disrupted the harmony. He paused, as if listening, and began following the shamisen's rhythm, shifting accents to align with Japanese patterns. This moment, when he stopped imposing his rhythm and began listening to the musician's music, was pivotal. From this point, their duet ceased to be a mere mix of 2 styles. It became a unified whole. One witness, a young Japanese woman named Bayako, who worked at a nearby cafe at the time, later recalled that she had never heard anything like it. It was as if 2 worlds met and began speaking the same language, she remembered. I didn't understand the words, but I felt they were talking about something important. About the beauty of the night, about how different cultures can be close even if they seem distant. For Freddie, this moment wasn't just a musical experiment. It was a reminder of why he had become a musician in the first place. In studios and on Queen's stages, music often became the product of careful planning, where every note was discussed, every arrangement meticulously thought out. But here, on Ginza Street, music was born spontaneously, without preparation, and it was precisely this that made it so alive. He felt his heart beat in time with the shamisen's rhythm, his voice becoming part of something greater than himself. Especially impressive was the duet's finale. Sensing the melody approaching its climax, Freddie began singing louder, adding notes reminiscent of his famous vocal passages in Queen songs. But instead of dominating, he left space for the shamisen, allowing the instrument to conclude the melody. The final measures sounded almost like a dialogue. Freddie's voice posed a question, and the shamisen answered, creating a sense of completion while leaving room for reflection. When the music stopped, silence reigned for a moment. Even the city noise, usually so loud at this hour, seemed to quiet down to honor this moment. Then applause broke out, first hesitantly from those who had just joined the small crowd, then loudly and sincerely, as if people understood they had just witnessed something unique. Freddie smiled, feeling adrenaline gradually give way to tranquility. He looked at the musician, and mutual understanding passed between their gazes. No words were needed. They both knew they had just created something that didn't fit into familiar genres or styles. It was music born in the moment, without expectations or conventions, and it was precisely this that made it so sincere. One passerby, a young man with a cassette recorder, approached them and, smiling hesitantly, pointed to the recording. Freddie nodded, indicating he didn't object. He knew such moments were rarely captured, and he was grateful someone had decided to preserve their music. But at that moment, he wasn't thinking about the recording becoming a legend. For him, what mattered was that the music lived, even if only for a few minutes. Later, recalling this jam, Freddie often said it was moments like these that reminded him why he had chosen music as his path. Not stadium concerts, not millions of album sales, but these spontaneous encounters where two people, not speaking the same language, could create something beautiful simply by listening to each other. This meeting on Ginza Street became for him not just a musical experiment, but a reminder that music isn't about fame or money. It's about moments that can't be reproduced, about a dialogue that continues even after the last note fades, and it was precisely this, as he later admitted, that he would never forget. The evening spent under a street lamp in the heart of Tokyo. When the music stopped and the final applause faded into the night air, Freddie, without hesitation, headed back to his hotel, leaving the musician to continue his street performance. He felt the moment had ended as naturally as it began and didn't want to disrupt its wholeness. But in the crowd watching their duet, there were those who understood they had witnessed something unique. Among them was a young Japanese man named Takeshi, a music student who that evening was walking through Ginza with a portable Sony TC-D5M cassette recorder, a gift from his father. He hadn't planned to record anything serious, simply accustomed to capturing interesting city sounds to later listen to and learn from. But when he saw Freddie Mercury, the man whose albums he had listened to since childhood, begin improvising with a street musician, he instinctively turned on the recording. Takeshi didn't know what to do with the cassette. He understood he had recorded something incredible, but couldn't have guessed how important it would become. Returning home, he carefully packed the cassette into a box with his other recordings and stored it on a shelf, deciding he would one day tell friends about this episode. But life, as it often does, took its course. A few months later, Takeshi moved to Osaka to continue his studies, and the cassette remained in his parents' old apartment. Years passed, and memories of that evening began to fade, turning into a blurry image, like an old photograph bleached by the sun. Nevertheless, a few years later, when rumors about Freddie's secret jam in Tokyo began spreading among Queen fans, Takeshi remembered his recording. He tried to find the cassette, but discovered the box had disappeared. His parents, having moved to a new house, had thrown away old things, including the box with unnecessary cassettes. I remember my father said, "Why do you need these old recordings? You've long since switched to CDs." Takeshi recalled in an interview with a Japanese music magazine in 2005. For him, it was a bitter disappointment. He knew he had held something unique in his hands, but had missed the chance to preserve it forever. But the story didn't end with Takeshi. That same evening, another witness, Ayako, the cafe girl mentioned earlier, told her boss, the owner of a small experimental music label, about what she had seen. Intrigued by her description, the boss began gathering information and even trying to find the musician who had played the shamisen. However, all his attempts proved fruitless. The musician, as it turned out, wasn't a regular street performer in Ginza. He had been seen in this district only a few times, each time disappearing as suddenly as he had appeared. Some witnesses claimed he lived in the Asakusa district, but none of the locals could say for sure who he was. In the 1990s, as interest in Queen's unreleased recordings grew, rumors of the mysterious jam reached Western fans. In a 1997 interview, Queen's former manager Jim Beach, answering a question about whether Freddie had been in Tokyo in 1985, confirmed that Mercury had indeed visited Japan at that time, but hadn't participated in official events. He sometimes left alone to just be in silence, Beach said. I wouldn't be surprised if he really walked around the city and interacted with local musicians. However, he refused to comment on this specific Street Jam episode, stating he had no evidence of its existence. This didn't stop fans from continuing their search. In 2003, a group of enthusiasts in Tokyo created a website dedicated to finding the recording. They interviewed dozens of people who had lived in the Ginza district in the 1980s and gathered several testimonies confirming that Freddie Mercury had indeed walked around the city incognito. An elderly woman who worked at a souvenir shop on Suganami Street recalled seeing a man with long hair and a beard who often bought tea and watched street musicians. But when asked if it was Freddie, she merely shrugged. Many foreigners visited Tokyo in those years. I didn't know who he was. Despite the lack of evidence, the legend of Ginza Twilight continued to grow. In 2010, Japanese director Hiromasa Hirano released the documentary The Lost Jam, attempting to reconstruct the story based on witness testimonies. The film featured interviews with Takeshi Ayako and several others who claimed to have been present. However, no audio recording was found. Even when the filmmakers contacted Sony to check if archives of portable recorders from that era survived, the answer was negative. Most recordings from that time had long been lost or destroyed. However, there were pieces of evidence that made people think. In 2015, at the Nippon Broadcasting System Tokyo radio station archive, an unnamed cassette dated 1985 was found. It contained a nighttime broadcast, but in one of the gaps between programs, a fragment of music was heard that some experts described as very similar to the description of Ginza Twilight. However, the recording quality was so poor that it was impossible to determine if it was truly Freddie Mercury. After several months of analysis, experts concluded it was most likely a fragment from a local jazz club, and the cassette was returned to the archive. The most intriguing lead appeared in 2018 when, in the private archive of Japanese photographer Kenji Takahashi, photos taken on the night of October 12, 1985 were discovered. One of them, blurry and indistinct due to poor lighting, captured a person resembling Freddie Mercury standing next to a musician in a kimono. The photographer, who died in 2002, left a diary mentioning he had shot an interesting scene on Ginza Street that night, but didn't specify details. Queen experts who examined the photo couldn't confirm or deny its authenticity. Too little was visible to make a definitive conclusion. Despite all efforts, the Ginza Twilight recording has never been found. But the very idea of its existence continues to inspire musicians and fans worldwide. In 2020, the Japanese indie group Tokyo Mirage released a track titled Ginza Twilight, homage to Freddie, attempting to recreate the atmosphere of that evening using shamisen sounds and vocal improvisations in Freddie's style. The song became a hit in Japan and received positive reviews from critics, who called it a tribute to a moment that may never be confirmed but will always live in legend. Today, nearly 40 years after that evening, the question of whether the Ginza Twilight recording existed remains open. Some consider it merely an urban legend, embellished over the years. Others are convinced that somewhere in Tokyo's archives or a private collection lies a cassette that could confirm this story. But even if the recording is never found, the very idea that Freddie Mercury, a man whose name is synonymous with grand shows and flawless studio recordings, once stopped on the street to sing with a stranger continues to inspire. Perhaps this is the magic of this story. It reminds us that music isn't only albums and concerts, but also moments born spontaneously, without expectations or conventions. And even if the recording is lost, the very idea that two musicians, speaking different languages, could create something beautiful simply by listening to each other remains alive. As Freddie once said in an interview, "Music isn't what you record in the studio. It's what happens between people when they forget their differences and simply play." Perhaps this is why the legend of the secret Tokyo Jam continues to live, even without proof. Because sometimes the most valuable music is the kind you can't record but can never forget. The legend of the secret Tokyo Jam isn't just a story about how Freddie Mercury once sang with a street musician. It's a story about how music can be free, effortless, and sincere, even when created by two people who don't speak the same language. It continues to live not because it's confirmed by a recording or official testimonies, but because it reflects what people want to believe. That even the most famous musician can remain just a musician when he hears the call to improvise. For Queen fans, this story is a reminder that Freddie wasn't only the showman who created some of rock's most spectacular hits, but also a man who never lost touch with music's simplest origins. In interviews throughout his career, he repeatedly emphasized that music for him wasn't about fame or sales, but about moments when two people could create something beautiful simply by following the rhythm. "I don't want to be a singer who sings the same songs all his life," he said in 1983. "I want music to stay alive, to surprise even me." It's precisely this philosophy that makes the Tokyo Jam story so convincing. Freddie always valued improvisation. In the studio, he often suggested Queen musicians experiment, creating new parts on the fly, and in live performances, he wasn't afraid to change arrangements to make each show unique. For him, music was a dialogue, and it was precisely this that allowed him to fit seamlessly into the shamisen player's performance. He didn't come to dominate, but to listen and respond. But this story is important not only for Queen fans. It speaks to how music can unite people despite cultural and language barriers. In 1985, when the world was divided between East and West, when Japan and Western Europe seemed like two separate universes, Freddie and the unknown musician created something that didn't fit into genre or cultural frameworks. Their duet is a metaphor for how art can become a bridge between worlds, even when those worlds seem non-overlapping. Today, in the era of digital technology and globalization, when musical styles blend faster than ever, this story gains new meaning. We've grown accustomed to artists collaborating across oceans, tracks created in joint online sessions, but precisely because of this, moments when music is born spontaneously, without preparation or producer oversight, become increasingly valuable. The Ginza Street Jam is a reminder that the most authentic music often arises where it's least expected, in an alley, under a street lamp, between two people who simply decided to play together. Moreover, this story underscores the importance of respecting traditions. Freddie, whose music always leaned toward experimentation, didn't try to impose his style on the shamisen player. Instead, he adapted to the rhythm and melody of the Japanese instrument, allowing himself to become part of something greater. This isn't appropriation but dialogue, the very thing that makes cultural exchange true art, rather than superficial imitation. Perhaps the strongest aspect of this legend is its incompleteness. The absence of a recording, unclear details, contradictory testimonies, all this keeps the story alive. It hasn't frozen in archives or official biographies, but continues evolving, accumulating new interpretations. For some, it's proof that Freddie remained true to himself until the end. For others, it's a reminder that music doesn't need to be recorded to exist. And precisely because of this, even if the Ginza Twilight recording is never found, this story will remain part of musical memory. Because sometimes the most valuable music is the kind you can't hear but can never forget. Because sometimes the most important thing isn't the result, but the moment when two people decided to play together, simply because the music was playing. The story of the Ginza Street Jam isn't just a legend about a famous musician who once stepped down from the pedestal of fame to sing with a stranger. It's a story about how music lives not in studios, not in album sales, and not in grand concerts, but in those moments when two people, divided by language and culture, find a common rhythm. For Freddie Mercury, whose career was filled with large-scale projects and flawless arrangements, this moment was a reminder of the most important thing. Music is a dialogue that requires no words but demands sincerity. In the final years of his life, Freddie often returned to the idea that music should remain alive. In 1987, just 2 years before his death, he gave an interview where he said, "I don't want my songs to become museum exhibits. I want people to hear them and think, what if I tried playing this my way?" This philosophy likely inspired his nighttime encounter in Tokyo. He didn't come there to show what he could do. He came to hear something new, to let music arise on its own, without plans or expectations. This is why the story continues to inspire musicians worldwide. In 2022, Japanese pianist Ryota Suzuki, known for his fusion music experiments, stated in an interview, "When I hear the story of how Freddie played with a street musician in Tokyo, I understand that music has no borders. It's not about technique or fame. It's about the moment when you forget who you are and simply play." Such statements are becoming increasingly common. Artists, regardless of genre, are beginning to return to the idea of spontaneous improvisation, to the thought that music can exist outside commercial frameworks and social media. But the most important thing this story tells us today is the value of respecting other cultures. Freddie didn't try to turn traditional Japanese music into Western rock. He didn't impose his style. Instead, he adapted, listened, learned. In a world where cultural exchange often boils down to superficial borrowing, this moment reminds us that true dialogue is possible only when we're ready to become listeners, not just speakers. And perhaps this is why the Ginza Twilight legend remains alive. Because it's not about music needing to be recorded to exist. It's about the moment that can't be held onto but changes those who experience it. For Freddie, it was the moment he remembered why he became a musician. For the shamisen player, it might have been the moment he realized his traditions could speak a language understood by the entire world. And for those who heard their do it, even if only for a few minutes, it was a moment they would never forget. The music born that evening may be lost, but the spirit of that music, the spirit of freedom, respect, and sincerity, continues to live. And as long as there are people who believe in the power of spontaneous creativity, this story will inspire them to new encounters, new dialogues, and new songs that aren't yet in albums. Because the most authentic music always begins where plans end.